Welcome to this second video, all about lime plastering. In our first video, as you can see here, we showed a sort of a sample of lime plastering on salivite board with some insulation behind. In the same video, we also showed how to do a conventional panel, as this is a full panel and actually on my landing in my own home. This next video is going to show you how to plaster, using lime plaster, on a rough gloss internal wall, and this differs quite a lot from plastering onto salivite. Salivite tends to absorb some of the moisture and it makes it dry out a little bit quicker, but of course when you're plastering onto gloss paint you've got a completely different problem because there's nothing to absorb the moisture. Okay, so this is the wall. As you can see, horrible gloss. Mind you, the timbers aren't that good either, but the whole surface is just covered in lumps and bumps, and it is really a very thick gloss paint that's been applied to this. As you can see, the whole room is spoilt because the wall is just too lumpy and bumpy. It really does need to be nice and smooth, but not necessarily dead flat. But you can also see a couple of areas there where it looks like someone's actually repaired the wall up to a line, and there are lumps sticking out which sort of don't quite look right, and I'd prefer it to be a nice lime plaster rather than something sort of hard and glossy. When you see the end result you'll see exactly what I mean. So there really are just sort of two options. The first option really is to take all the plaster off and replaster using salivite board, but that's a lot of work to do, and also it tends to destroy the sort of the history of that particular part of the plastering. So the second option is really just to cover that over so you retain the existing. So that's probably the best way to do it, and I think that's the option I'm going to adopt. Right, so here we go then. So what I've done here is I've actually covered the whole wall in a PVA. The PVA I mix generally sort of about 50-50. Yeah, it just depends. You can try it a little bit higher or a little bit lower, but basically all you're doing is sealing the surface, and you're making sure that the plaster, the lime plaster, has something to adhere to. So first thing I did was to roughly go over the plaster wall with some coarse sandpaper just to give a bit of a key, and then to apply fairly liberally the PVA adhesive. But be careful, because when you're brushing the PVA adhesive it does tend to drip, and it will drip all over your beams, so it might be an idea to cover those beams up before you start that. Okay, let's start the plaster. So when I'm doing a larger wall I tend to use a hawk or something like that just to drop the plaster on. Here I'm using a stainless steel float. It's quite a small float actually, but when you're doing difficult little tiny areas within your own home you need a smaller float. The bigger float does give you a flatter surface, but then, as I said earlier, I'm not actually looking for a dead flat surface. Always start on the bottom, sort of bottom right hand side if you're right handed, and just work your way across and trying to get an even depth of plaster right the way over that part of the wall. Don't try and rush it, take your time, you've got plenty of time. The beading edges around here I wouldn't worry too much about. I'm not going to go round to the reveal. What I'm just going to do is to finish the plaster actually at the reveal, and then just before it dries I'm going to run my fingers down there to smooth it off. Right, okay, let's get this plaster on the wall then. So before we start, let me just give you a few sort of pointers as to how to plaster properly, certainly as far as I'm concerned anyway. So what you're doing is you're putting a thin layer of plaster over the whole wall, and you start by building it up from the bottom right hand corner. Don't be too worried about the overall smoothness of the plaster, just try and get an even coat on over the whole area. What you then try and do, and not too quickly, is to keep rubbing the float over the top of the plaster to remove all the lines. The more the plaster dries, and it gets to a stage where you can still actually get the plaster to move around the wall, but it's not too wet that you leave marks in the wall with your float. So keep an eye on it, and different days and different types of walls, and you'll find that the plaster will dry at different rates. But don't overwork it because it starts to drag off the wall. All you need to do is just to wait until that point in time when if you just touch your finger onto the plaster, if it makes a very small impression, then you're just about ready to go over it for the last time, just to get it absolutely smooth. And then just before it goes hard, right on at the end of its drying stage, you can then just go over it lightly with the float, and you'll get a really nice, smooth, hard finish. No apologies for the soppy hat, sorry about that. So it's going to take quite a time for that to dry, so don't panic. I would leave it, in normal atmosphere, I would leave it a couple of hours. Just keep going back to it periodically, just to see whether or not it's started to harden off. Because again, the plaster that we're putting on here, I've made it fairly dry, and the reason is because, as I said earlier, the plaster will not, or because you've got PVA on the wall, will not actually start to suck the moisture out of the plaster and allow it to dry. So when you put it on, it goes on pretty wet, and it doesn't seem to dry very quickly. It will dry eventually, but don't forget that it dries from the top down. So in other words, all the moisture tends to come out of the bottom level of the plaster. You're going to have to put it on fairly thick as well. And the reason for that is because when you're putting plaster onto salivite boarding, what tends to happen is the salivite boarding absorbs some of the plaster, and it means that you can't feel any grit when you're plastering. Whereas when you're putting plaster onto a solid wall, you can feel the amount of grit actually in the plaster. But don't worry, if you build up the level of that plaster, probably about 4 or 5 millimeters, you'll find that it'll go on nice and smoothly, and you won't be able to hear that sort of grating noise as you run the float across. Oops! Can anybody spot the deliberate mistake? I haven't blasted the beams yet, and here I am putting finished plaster on. So after the blasting, I may have a couple of little areas where I may have to make some repairs on the plaster, and I'll show you that later. And there we have it, almost a complete wall. All you've got to do now is to let it dry off a little bit, and then just keep going back to it and going over it, just to make sure that the surface is as nice as you possibly can get. And as you can see, we've now blasted the beams, and I'm just starting to make just a couple of repairs around where the blast actually caught the lime plaster. And the reason why it's caught it is because the lime plaster is still quite fresh. So here we are, we've put tape on the beam, and we've filled down from and blended into the existing plasterwork back down to the beam. And I do this normally using just an ordinary filler. You don't really need to use lime plaster, because you may elect to rub it down just to get that nice fine edge between the beam itself and the plasterwork. And remember, you can't actually rub down normal lime plaster because of all the little filaments in there. What tends to happen is they fluff up to the surface. So if you're going to rub stuff down and you're going to use a filler, use ordinary poly filler. So a quick tip here, always use a hoover to hoover up the dust after you've rubbed down plasterwork. And the reason is because if you try and wipe it with a cloth, what generally tends to happen is it rubs all the dust into the surface, and you'll never get it out, or certainly not easily anyway, and you might have to re-blast part of it. So just be a little bit careful, and use a good vacuum cleaner, and just pull out all that dust, and then, as I say, don't rub it in or brush it with a brush, because you just rub it into the surface. So we're pretty much done. All the plastering's done. It's now dried out, and I've made a few minor repairs. It's all looking pretty good. So here's a view of the finished article. As you can see, the main wall is nice and smooth, but not necessarily flat. But I've got rid of all of the horrible marks. The beams are all nicely blasted and contrast well with the wall. So let's look at the overall picture of the finished room. Actually, it's a landing. It's not actually a full-blown wall. But as you can see, the beams are cut really nice. I've media blasted these rather than using dry ice, just really because of the type of rough surface that I actually had. There's the panel that we did in a previous video, and as you can see, all the beams are cleaned up lovely. Oh, and I've managed to put a new radiator in there as well. So there you have it. One finished room. We've even got carpet down now. Look at that. Well, actually, I've got to say that I'm pretty pleased with that. The whole room is actually looking really good, although I haven't been too invasive. All I've done is to clean the beams and replaster a couple of the walls. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a completed job. If you've got walls which are covered in gloss and you're prepared to have a go at lime plastering, do give it a go, because it's not that difficult. And to be fair, if you spend a bit of time on it, I'm sure you can get it looking absolutely stunning. So what could possibly go wrong? Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and there are other videos available plastering onto Salovite, and there is a main video from Dry Ice Restoration which shows how to clean beams using various methods. If you have any comments on this video, or the way I've presented it, or the actual content, please do leave a comment and I'll be glad to come back to you. Take care.